Redefine security. What are the threats towards the humanity in the 10 to 50 years coming up?
I think that the discussions here are very important because unlike most audiences which I talk to, you actually really can do something in your own countries to get these problems discussed, to try to get reasonable answers to them, and then do something to make those answers stick.
This is the second of a two-part series of a dialogue, a political dialogue among politicians at the United Nations. The first dialogue focused on the environment, the problems facing the planet from deforestation, from ozone depletion, and from global warming. The 46 members of parliaments from around the world first described the special environmental problems that their own countries were facing.
15% of our national territory is directly affected by this lack of ozone over Antarctica.
It appears that, much of the country has been turned into a desert.
15% of the people could be affected by a few degrees of rise in the temperature. 20% of the land will go underwater. 16% of the housing would go underwater, and 20% of food production would be affected.
Because of deforestation, thousands, if not millions of Filipinos died in a flash flood. The forest is ill because of too much pollution in the air.
The politicians then discussed what could be done to save the planet. They developed principles to govern future action.
And we try to come to the solution to save the forest. It's the global heritage. It is not belong only to Indonesia or belong to one country.
Pero la afirmación que aquí se ha hecho de que el que contamina paga,
he who pollutes should pay is a very basic affirmation in any forum having to do with environment.
No se trata de repartir culpas.
We are not blaming countries,
sino en
but
asumir
assuming responsibilities, collective responsibilities, and particular ones.
They then urged that certain action be taken.
We should be doing a lot more to encourage recycling industries, to put government investment in recycling industries.
I would ask you to discuss, even on the parliamentary level, that we have to change our lifestyle. And if I say we, then I mean, first of all, the Northern Hemisphere.
Today, the politicians turn to the question of peace. For millennia, humanity has been struggling to find a way of establishing peace on Earth among all peoples. Now, with the ending of the Cold War, the opportunities for doing so are greater than ever before. In opening the dialogue yesterday at the United Nations, Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali challenged the politicians present to do their utmost to help realize this goal.
Des Nations Unies en faveur de la paix for the sake of peace and social justice concern the whole of mankind. In my report entitled Agenda for Peace, which you, Madam, mentioned, I presented to Member States the major outlines of what our work could be in the work of preventive diplomacy and the restoration and subsequently the maintenance of peace and democratization. I ardently hope that you will be the sounding boards of these proposals and participate in the debate, which I hope this will see the beginning of.
Professor Makram Abaid responds to his remarks.
The proposals you have set forth in Agenda for Peace, with you as an advocate of vital global strategies, by providing a meaningful document for debates and discussions, is contributing significantly to advancing the cause of peace throughout the world. It is the responsibility of the international community to advance on these ideas, ensuring that the necessary political will to do so is forthcoming. For this, the leadership of parliamentarians is essential.
The Secretary-General calls for the politicians of the world to be the sounding board for his proposals in his report, Agenda for Peace. That document had been requested by the Security Council earlier in the year during its historic first summit meeting. But what did these proposals contain? Let us listen to our representatives, the representatives of the peoples of the United Nations, as they grapple with these questions. The Honourable Walter McLean of Canada opens the discussion with an appeal for political support in Congresses and parliaments around the world for the UN's report, Agenda for Peace.
I think the political question before the UN and before the member governments is how far can we go? And if governments don't seize it, someone else is going to fill that vacuum. And if the United Nations is not able, because of the dynamics of governments, and doesn't have some political will generated from the growing democratic elements that are across the world, then that may well be lost.
What then does the UN report propose? Taking advantage of the ending of the Cold War, the report seeks to make the Charter work as was originally envisaged by the Founding Fathers of the United Nations at San Francisco in 1945. The theory of UN collective security is that if conflict breaks out, the Council may declare a threat to the peace and impose binding decisions on the parties, backing this up with economic sanctions and, ultimately, military force. The new report seeks to resuscitate this whole framework for keeping the peace. But Agenda for Peace also goes further and puts forward some bold and far-reaching proposals for strengthening the capacity of the UN in keeping the peace in modern times, nearly 50 years after San Francisco. There is, for example, the idea of preventive deployment, whereby UN troops are brought in along one side of a nation's border at the request of that nation if it fears possible aggression from a neighbor. But this is a controversial issue. How much extra risk does this impose on UN troops now? Are nations, both governments and citizenry, willing to place their sons and daughters at greater risk than before? On the idea of preventive deployment, the politicians have a range of opinions to offer. The Honourable Warren Almond from the Canadian Parliament supports the idea of preventive deployment.
When a member country felt seriously threatened, that member country would appeal to the Secretary General, who would then authorize the regional peace force to go to the borders in question and plant the UN flag and set up a barrier between the possible invader and the country to be invaded.
But the Right Honourable Helen Clark, former Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, has her doubts on grounds of practicability.
It sounds beguiling, it sounds attractive, but when you think it through, what if Kuwait had called upon the UN to deploy on its side of the border a force? That can't be done quickly. Iraq was ready, nobody else was. It could simply have brought forward the timing of an invasion. really events had slipped too far by that point.
So does Australia's Gary Gibson, but on grounds more of the risk to his country's troops.
If Australia is going to commit any forces to regional peace forces or preventive deployment forces, we want to know that our forces are going in a reasonably, with some rights to protect themselves, better than I think they have at the moment.
Advising the politicians is former UN official in charge of peacekeeping, Sir Brian Urquhart.
The idea of being a tripwire is a very unattractive idea to soldiers. They do not like it. If you have a preventive deployment, it seems to me the only way you could justify it is to make sure that if the tripwire is tripped, something pretty drastic happens.
Emma Bonino, Deputy Speaker of the Italian Parliament, agrees.
It's doubtful, in my opinion, if Croatia would have accepted a preventive deployment. I mean, 1 year back.
Theo Sambuaga of the Indonesian Parliament thinks some criteria for preventive deployment would be necessary for the Security Council to decide when to go in or not.
Preventive deployment, how could you determine that this kind of situation in a certain area, it is a real threat for preventive deployment, and that preventive deployment could deter conflict. In other case, that deployment also can make the conflict worse or can make the hostilities coming to the fire situation.
The chairman, David MacDonald of Canada, sums up.
It's been clear from the remarks of you, Sir Brian, and others that preventive deployment has considerable difficulty attached to it. But I'm not sure that we've exhausted the possibilities of preventive diplomacy.
Preventive diplomacy attracts a lot of support from the politicians.
I suppose the overwhelming concern that I have is that the UN is starting to look as though it could end up getting bogged down in conflicts, rather as the imperial powers used to do.
Preventive diplomacy is identified by the United Nations Secretary-General in his report as the initial early efforts to prevent a dispute getting to the point of conflict. All the politicians present agree that preventive diplomacy has hitherto been underutilized. As Gary Gibson of Australia puts it,
I think parliamentarians in Australia would prefer to see a much greater emphasis on the preventive diplomacy efforts rather than a broadening of the military role at the United Nations, as indicated, I think, by the concept of a preventive, of a standing regional force. We think that in certain situations, such as in the Iraq-Kuwait exercise or situation, there were a lot of occasions there where we believe the UN or regional groupings with the backing of the UN could have intervened at a much earlier stage to try and bring about some form of resolution. I believe some of the statements that were being made, when one read through the rhetoric and the standing up and being strong type rhetoric that was coming through, particularly from Iraq, there was actually, I think, a lot of pleas there to say, we've got a real problem and we want somebody, we're going to do something about it unless somebody else does something about it.
This view gets wide support. Dr. Akiba of Japan.
The preventive diplomacy is very important. Perhaps the entire, in quote-unquote invasion of Iraq into Kuwait would have been avoided had some of the functions mentioned in the agenda for peace of the Secretary General, information gathering, monitoring, disclosure of information to the public, the utilization of the International Court of Justice been strengthened or added to the existing list of power of the Secretary General before anything actually started.
May-Britt Thoreen of Sweden.
I must say, by knowledge from Yugoslavia, I've been in the Defense Committee of Sweden and went to Yugoslavia, and I said, if UN ever thinks of bringing forces in fighting in Yugoslavia, that's it. They know how to fight it in their countries. And it would be, for not only principal reasons, but also for practical reasons, not a very good idea.
George Fawkes of Great Britain.
I think first we need some kind of intelligence network for the United Nations. And By that, I'm not meaning that we should take over the CIA or MI6 or any combination of all two.
It's no good having a sentry if the rest of the community doesn't hear the alarm. And it's happened over and over again, and it's precisely what has happened, incidentally, very recently in regard to Yugoslavia, Somalia, Angola, and Mozambique. We don't seem to have learned that lesson yet, and I believe it's a place where parliamentarians can be of the greatest possible help.
But what if preventive diplomacy fails, and there is either no preventive deployment of UN troops, or preventive deployment proves inadequate and conflict breaks out? The UN Security Council declares a threat to the peace and resolves to use force? But at what stage of a crisis should it decide to use force?
In Britain, as you know, we've been talking about a rapid deployment force, and I think that's an essential part of the machinery that's needed. But as I say, I hope that by using other things like anticipation, like conciliation, like the International Court, like sanctions, the range of sanctions, we need also to talk about the range of sanctions.
Ad Melkert of the Netherlands agrees with his European colleague, especially on economic sanctions.
I wonder what could have happened if in the Iraq-Kuwait case the imposing sanctions would not have been limited mainly to sea control. But what would have happened if, for instance, also by the introduction of military control force, also supplies over land would have been controlled more strictly than could be the case in the situation which we agreed upon in the Iraq-Kuwait case, because it was simply not possible to put military forces on the ground in order to control the embargo.
If we compare, I know that at the beginning it was different, because Iraq and Kuwait were two independent states and one was the aggressor of the other. And Yugoslavia was different because at the beginning Croatia and Slovenia were not independent states and was looked at internal affairs. Difference between the sanction on in the Iraq cases and nowadays, I mean, compared the two, this one are simply ridiculous. And no reasonable people can believe that they will work.
But the reality is, economic sanctions have not to date successfully ended conflict. The UN has been obliged on two principal occasions to resort to military force, in Korea in the early 1950s and in the Gulf in the early 1990s. Warren Almond of Canada comments on the more recent Gulf operation.
Multilateral force that was put together for that conflict was put together quickly and in a very ad hoc way, and as we all know, unlike Korea, was not under the UN flag, was not directly responsible to the United Nations through the Officers Committee, or subject to the direction of the Secretary General, but under U.S. officers. So there's concern that we have to advance in that kind of action by the UN, but it should be more clearly under the Charter and more clearly under the rule of law, so that it applies equally in all circumstances of aggression.
If the UN is resolved to use military force to enforce its decisions, how capable is it of doing this? At present, it has no standing army. Indeed, this was not necessarily envisaged in the Charter. It relies on member states to supply national armed forces.
We should have standing regional peace forces raised from the armed forces of the member countries on a rotating basis. These standing regional peace forces would be, as I say, stationed in different parts of the world, in the different continents where conflict or invasions were possibilities.
And I prefer having a really sound standby arrangement rather than aiming for a standing army regionally or globally. I simply don't think it's on the cards with the size of defense forces which most countries now have, or indeed with the financial stringencies under which governments and international organizations now operate.
I tend to agree with Sir Brian that it's
probably more pragmatic to go for standby arrangements. Although I think we should not underestimate the questions of the risks we want to take in order to make the UN effective. I know very well also in our own parliaments that we have thorough discussions about the risks which our soldiers are running when we send them to Yugoslavia or to Cambodia or to another place in the world.
Lasedi Motabameli of Botswana agrees.
The idea of a staying force does not, I mean, I don't buy it that much. I think perhaps what other countries must be told is that they must have their forces ready so that when they are called upon to subscribe, you know, a number of soldiers, they should do so quickly.
Sir David Steele of Britain.
But I understand the General Assembly did suggest there should be the creation of some kind of international volunteer force, a sort of international peace corps. And I think not enough has been done to tap the tremendous expertise and goodwill and resources of voluntary effort around the world which could be made available to the UN.
George Falks believes the World Court should have a greater role to play.
And I hope that we can see it, and other people have mentioned this, the World Court, the International Court of Justice, developed much more. And I also hope that we can try and get some commitments from the strongest powers in the world, including the United States, to accept the ruling of the International Court of Justice. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to get other countries to accept.
The International Court of Justice, based in The Hague, has existed since the birth of the United Nations itself, nearly 50 years ago. But it hears cases only between states. Increasingly, there is talk of an international criminal court. This would have jurisdiction to prosecute and sentence individuals anywhere around the world, leaders and citizens alike, if they violate certain international laws. Examples of such international crimes would include genocide, war crimes, terrorism, and drug trafficking, and perhaps aggression and environmental damage, such as the invasion of Kuwait and the firing of oil wells there. This idea has strong support from the politicians, especially Jim Leach of the U.S. Congress, who has led the effort in global action for such a court.
The world community ought to indicate through the United Nations that peacekeeping forces under a Security Council mandate should not only be policemen keeping the peace, but potentially magistrates arresting those who break the peace, and that there should be no shirking from the notion that the Pol Pots of the world, the Saddam Husseins of the world, and even the Milosevic's might well be held accountable with some sort of Security Council indictment to the rule of law, presumably under some sort of established mechanism, whether it be a permanent international criminal court, which this organization has indicated strong support for, or ad hoc kinds of courts.
Dr. Calmel of Peru agrees.
So anybody who breaks the law should know that sooner or later he or she will be judged, not by his or her own forces. In this case, Hussein is still in power because he thinks that the people love him. But how do we put him in the hands of an international court with, of course, laws that should exist for those crimes and should apply equally to all citizens of the world?
Advisor Sir Brian Urquhart concurs with this political support for an international criminal court.
In almost all international disputes, and in some others, there are fairly large areas of justiciable disputes which can be dealt with in a legal manner if governments get used to the idea of doing it. In ordinary life in a nation state, if you have a grievance or believe that you have been wronged, your immediate reaction nowadays is not to punch the other person in the nose, but to go to the courts. And I think it's high time we got to that in the international community.
But this goes back to the willingness, and we have to debate in our own parliament, and a sort of limitation of the national sovereignty, deciding when, in what cases, and for what reason. And it comes back to the other big point, which is we have been run by the rule of non-interference in internal affairs, maybe there is a point now not only of the right to interference, but also sometimes on the duty of interference for some particular causes. And
the question of national sovereignty sparks a major debate among the politicians of all countries, north and south, around the world.
On the question of national sovereignty, could we put up for debate the whole question that we were prepared to give up national sovereignty in the Cold War? We allowed, under NATO and the Warsaw Pact, we had a certain amount of sovereignty that we gave up. Why are we suddenly becoming so enamored with national sovereignty as if we haven't given it up in the past?
The problem with national sovereignty at the end of the 20th century is that the UN Charter, written some 50 years ago, makes national sovereignty paramount and greatly restricts the right of the international community either to intervene in a nation's affairs or to direct it as to what to do. Some are calling for a change. Sir David Steele of Britain.
And I think we have to look at the fundamental question of revision of that part of the UN Charter and the creation of a set of guidelines which will actually positively encourage the international authority to intervene where there is gross and persistent denial of the provisions of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, or where there is the denial of the right to peaceful coexistence of nations and communities, or where there is widespread and lasting damage to the global and regional environment.
Gary Guiteau of the legitimate Parliament of Haiti, overthrown in a coup in 1991.
Personally, I support the idea of a fast intervention by the UN to evaluate the political situation in countries before the situation becomes too complicated.
What you have seen is the second of a two-part series on We the Peoples. All of the 46 politicians representing the national parliaments and congresses of 32 countries were members of Parliamentarians for Global Action, which organized the dialogue. The results of the discussions were distilled into a policy paper on the shape of a world order for the 1990s and presented by Global Action to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Boutros Boutros-Ghali, in March 1993. Parliamentarians for Global Action believes that the world community, represented at the United Nations, needs a democratic input into its deliberations from the politicians, those who are elected by We the Peoples, in whose name the UN Charter is written. In future years, we may see this come to pass, where all the peoples of the world can feel that their voices are truly represented in the global council that is the United Nations.
I think everybody knows very well what the underlying basic long-term issues are, which are going to determine whether life on this planet is going to be worth living for most of its inhabitants by the middle of the next century or not.